Alison Pratt was the kind of woman who never made headlines, until the night she vanished without a trace from her quiet home on Holloway Lane. In a town where everyone knew everyone, her disappearance wasn't just shocking, it was impossible to understand. No enemies, no signs of struggle, just a warm cup of tea left untouched, and a mystery that would spiral into one of the most chilling unsolved cases in Elmridge's history. What began as an ordinary night quickly unraveled into a dark, calculated nightmare, one that would expose a hidden past, a dangerous drifter, and a trail of clues buried deep in the woods. It was just another quiet night in Elmridge, Pennsylvania, a town known for its peaceful streets and tightly knit community. On November 14th, 2017, the air was cold and still, the kind of night where most residents stayed indoors, wrapped in blankets, and tuned into their favorite evening shows. Alison Pratt, a 34-year-old librarian, had just returned home from work. She lived alone in a cozy 2-story house on Holloway Lane, a street lined with similar modest homes where everyone knew each other by name. Nothing about that evening seemed unusual. Alison had texted her sister around 8 p.m, made a cup of tea by 9 how, and was likely preparing to settle in for the night. But what happened next would become one of the most chilling and baffling mysteries the town had ever seen. At 10:42 p.m, a 911 call came in from a concerned neighbor who reported hearing a sudden scream followed by what sounded like a loud thud or bang. When she looked out her window, she saw Alison's front door swinging open and the porch light flickering. Alarmed, she dialed emergency services. The police arrived minutes later to find the front door ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry. Everything inside the house appeared untouched, almost too normal. The kitchen light was still on, and a steaming cup of tea sat on the counter. Her phone lay on the coffee table, unlocked. A book sat open on the armrest of her couch, as if she had only stepped away for a moment. As officers moved through the house, they found no signs of a struggle. There was no broken glass, no blood, no overturned furniture. Upstairs, her bed was made. Her purse was still hanging on the coat rack by the door. It looked like she had simply vanished. But then, they noticed something odd. Muddy footprints leading from the back door into the hallway. The prints were smudged and inconsistent, almost as if someone had tried to wipe them away. They ended abruptly at the foot of the staircase. There were no matching prints upstairs, no indication of where they had gone next. Within hours, a missing person alert was issued. Police canvassed the neighborhood and questioned anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Most reported nothing. No strange cars, no suspicious figures, no unusual sounds, except the neighbor who had made the 911 call. She remained shaken, insisting she had seen someone in a dark coat walking quickly down the sidewalk right after the scream. But in the dim light, she couldn't make out a face. By morning, the case had taken over the town. Flyers went up. Search parties formed. Local news outlets picked up the story. But no one could explain how someone like Alison, a woman with no known enemies, no history of mental health struggles, and no reason to disappear, could simply be gone. Her disappearance made no sense, and that made it all the more terrifying. As investigators dug deeper into Alison Pratt's disappearance, they quickly realized they were dealing with more than just a missing person case. Something didn't add up. Her house showed no signs of forced entry or struggle, and nothing valuable had been taken. Her car was still parked in the driveway. It was as if she had walked out the door and vanished into thin air. But the muddy footprints, the unlocked phone, and the still warm tea suggested something else, something darker. Police began combing through surveillance footage from traffic and security cameras placed throughout Elmridge and nearby roads. That's when they found it. At exactly 10:17 p.m., 25 minutes before the 911 call, a white pickup truck appeared on a traffic camera at the intersection near Holloway Lane. It was moving slowly, almost creeping through the neighborhood. The vehicle turned onto Holloway Lane and then parked just a few houses down from Allison's. Its headlights went off, and the engine remained running for several minutes before shutting down. The footage didn't show anyone exiting the truck, but it sat there until 10:38 p.m., 4 minutes before the neighbor made the emergency call. Then, just as mysteriously as it had arrived, the truck turned back on and drove away in the opposite direction. The truck had no front license plate, and the rear plate was too blurry to read clearly. Investigators attempted to enhance the footage, but the resolution was too low to be helpful. Still, the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Whoever was inside that truck had likely been watching Allison, and they had chosen that night to act. When a still image of the truck was released to the public, the response was immediate. Dozens of tips came in. Some claimed to have seen a similar vehicle at a local gas station earlier in the week. Others believed it belonged to a man who occasionally worked odd jobs around the area. Police followed every lead, but none of them held. The truck remained unaccounted for, and its driver was still a mystery. Meanwhile, detectives dug into Allison's background, looking for any reason someone might target her. She had no criminal record, no known enemies, and lived a quiet life. Her co-workers described her as warm but private. Her neighbors said she mostly kept to herself but was always polite. She had no history of romantic entanglements or troubled relationships. There was no sign of anyone stalking her or showing up unexpectedly. But one strange detail emerged from her phone records. In the 2 weeks before she vanished, she had received 5 calls from a number registered to a burner phone. The calls were all under a minute long, and no voicemails were left. Allison never mentioned them to anyone. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't a random crime. Someone had been watching her, perhaps following her routine, waiting for the right moment. The white pickup truck wasn't just passing through. It had come for a reason, but without a license plate or a witness who could place someone behind the wheel, the investigation was stuck in a cloud of uncertainty. Allison hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, and whoever took her had planned it carefully. 3 days after Allison Pratt's disappearance, hope was beginning to fade. Search teams had combed through nearby parks, hiking trails, and wooded areas with no sign of her. Volunteers passed out flyers, but no solid leads emerged. The town was on edge. People began locking their doors earlier, looking twice at strangers, and wondering if someone dangerous was living among them. Then, on the morning of November 17th, a hiker made a disturbing discovery in Ridgeview Forest, about 20 miles north of Elmridge. The man had been walking off trail when he noticed something fluttering in the wind, tangled in the low branches of a pine tree. As he approached, he realized it was a scarf, faded green with a tiny embroidered leaf in the corner. He didn't think much of it until he saw what looked like small tears along the edge, and a few dark stains that could have been blood. Recognizing the scarf from the widely circulated photos of Allison, he called the police immediately. When officers arrived, they began sweeping the surrounding area. Within 100 feet of the scarf, they found a shallow fire pit filled with ash, partially burned clothing tags, and what appeared to be the remains of a wallet. Forensics later confirmed the melted plastic inside was from Allison's driver's license. Not far from the fire pit, buried beneath a thin layer of dirt, they uncovered something even more puzzling. A worn-out duffel bag stuffed with cash, over $17,000 in small bundled bills, weathered but still intact. The lining of the bag contained something strange, a folded newspaper clipping from 2005. The article was about an armed robbery at a convenience store in northern Pennsylvania. It had been a violent crime. One employee had been seriously injured, and the robber had disappeared with close to $20,000 in cash. Police at the time had named a suspect, Russell Grady, a former mechanic with a history of theft, who vanished shortly after posting bail. He was never found. Suddenly, the investigation shifted. What had seemed like a clean disappearance in a quiet town was now tied to a long, cold criminal case. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. Could Russell Grady have resurfaced after more than a decade in hiding? If so, why target Allison? There was no known connection between them. She had no ties to that area or anyone mentioned in the article. But if Grady was behind her disappearance, it was clear he had planned carefully and disappeared just as quietly as he had come. A composite sketch, an updated wanted poster for Russell Grady, were released to the public. He would be in his late 40s now, possibly using an alias, possibly living off the grid. But despite renewed attention, no one had seen him. No fingerprints were found at the fire pit. The bag and its contents offered no DNA. It was like chasing a shadow. While the clues in Ridgeview Forest deepened the mystery, they offered no closure. The only thing clear was that Allison had not simply vanished. She had crossed paths with someone dangerous, someone who had been hiding for a long time and knew how to stay hidden. 4 months passed with no new developments. The leads had dried up, the white pickup truck had never been found, and Russell Grady's name faded back into silence. The discovery in Ridgeview Forest had confirmed everyone's worst fears. Allison, Pratt, had been taken, but beyond that, the trail seemed to vanish again, just like she had. Then, in early March 2018, a tip came in from a gas station clerk in upstate New York. He reported a man acting strangely late one night, paying in cash and avoiding eye contact. When he left, the clerk noticed a Pennsylvania license plate partially covered in mud. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get the attention of investigators. Police traced recent rentals in the area and found a small, remote cabin listed under a false name in the nearby town of Huron Hills. The owner said the renter had paid for 3 months in cash and hadn't been seen in over a week. Authorities secured a warrant and entered the cabin. What they found inside was chilling. The place was bare, no personal items, no food, barely any furniture. A single mattress on the floor, a rusted space heater, and an old lantern. But beneath, a loose floorboard, officers discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were several items wrapped in plastic. A piece of cloth later confirmed to contain Allison's blood, her driver's license, cracked and partially burned, and a flash drive. The walls were bare except for one thing, a crude hand-drawn map with several locations circled, including Ridgeview Forest and Elmridge. One name was scribbled in the corner, Grace. The flash drive contained a single document, a series of short, fragmented journal entries. The writing was erratic and full of strange references. The author, assumed to be Russell Grady, spoke about watching from the tree line, listening to her read, and the noise that wouldn't stop. There were mentions of Allison by name, and disturbing phrases like, "She reminded me of Grace," and "I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't let her leave." Investigators also found a small, weathered notebook tucked between the mattress and the wall. It read more like a confession than a journal. In uneven, pressured handwriting, it described a man who felt abandoned by the world. He wrote about losing a sister named Grace when he was young, and how her memory had followed him for years. He claimed Allison resembled her so closely it felt like she had come back. The final entry, dated only days before the cabin was abandoned, was brief. She screamed, "I didn't mean for it to go that way." Forensic teams confirmed the notebook and flash drive had traces of DNA matching Grady's past arrest record. But by the time they pieced everything together, he was gone again. A neighbor in Huron Hills mentioned seeing a man fitting his description at the bus station 2 nights before the police arrived. Surveillance footage confirmed it. He had boarded a northbound bus. After that, he disappeared completely. The cabin had offered answers, but no resolution. It confirmed what many had feared, that Allison had met a violent end at the hands of a man whose past had quietly resurfaced. But even with the confession, without a body, without an arrest, closure remained out of reach. Summer arrived in Elmridge with a strange quiet. The search for Allison Pratt had long since moved from rescue to recovery, but her family refused to give up. Her sister continued to call the detective weekly, hoping for news. The public's attention had faded, but for those who knew her, the pain lingered. Then, on July 21st, 2019, nearly 2 years after her disappearance, a hunter in a remote stretch of forest in Vermont made a horrifying discovery. While tracking deer near a ravine deep in the woods, he noticed a tangle of fabric caught in some underbrush. Curious, he climbed down to investigate and found what appeared to be tattered clothing, partially buried in soil and leaves. As he pulled the debris aside, he uncovered human remains, skeletal, weathered by time and the elements. Authorities were called immediately, and forensic teams arrived the following morning. They cordoned off the area and began the delicate process of recovering what they could. The remains were found near a shallow drop where runoff water had eroded the earth. Scattered among the bones were fragments of clothing that matched what Allison had been wearing the night she vanished. A rusted revolver lay just feet from the body, along with a weather-beaten notebook sealed inside a plastic sandwich bag. Inside were entries written in the same disturbed handwriting found in the previous cabin. The tone was darker, more unhinged. There were references to guilt, confusion, and a deepening sense of paranoia. One line stood out among the rest. "She wouldn't stop screaming. I thought she was her, but she wasn't." Dental records confirmed what many feared. The remains were Allison Pratt. For her family, it was an answer they never wanted but desperately needed. The cause of death was hard to determine due to the condition of the remains, but blunt force trauma to the skull was suspected. The notebook offered a grim confirmation that Russell Grady had indeed killed her. Whether it happened in the forest or elsewhere before her body was moved was never fully determined. Police believed that after fleeing the New York cabin, Grady had continued north, hiding in the woods and possibly living in temporary shelters. The revolver matched the style used in the 2005 robbery he had been wanted for. Despite renewed efforts, Grady himself was never found. There were rumors of sightings in Canada, even whispers of a man matching his description working at a logging camp, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. He had simply vanished, again. The case was officially closed later that year. Allison's family held a memorial service in Elmridge. The entire town came to pay their respects. Though justice had never been served, the truth had finally surfaced. Allison had not run away. She had not been lost. She had been taken by someone who had spent years in the shadows, someone no one had seen coming. For Elmridge, the tragedy became a reminder that even in the safest of places, darkness can find a way in, and sometimes it takes years for the truth to crawl back out.